The Chuquicamata mine in northern Chile is the largest open-pit copper mine in the world. Open for over 100 years, it's a man-made rift in the high plateau of the Atacama Desert, nearly 3 kilometers wide, 5 kilometers long, and 1 kilometer deep. So vast it can be seen from space. All this is to say, we don't need to look to hard sci-fi visions of the future to catch a glimpse of what terraforming looks like. We are already breaking and remaking the Earth right here and right now. Human beings have always harvested raw materials from the rest of the web of life. We extract water, plant life, materials of all kinds. But capitalism demands such a scale and intensity of extraction that it is reforming both our politics and our planet. And as we face down the task of rapidly decarbonising the global economy for a chance at a livable future, the demand for certain kinds of minerals needed to build green technology is only increasing. If you want things like solar panels and electrified transport networks, you need things like copper, cobalt, and lithium. Left-wing movements can feel caught on the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, the need to avoid the massive toll that mining and extraction can take on people and the environment. And on the other hand, the urgent need for those raw materials. Thea Riofrancos is an associate professor of political science at Providence College, a strategic co-director of the Climate and Community Project, and a fellow at the Transnational Institute. Her works include Resource Radicals, from petronationalism to post-extractivism in Ecuador, A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, and the forthcoming book, Extraction, The Frontiers of Green Capitalism. I asked her how we navigate the dilemma of extractivism, how we integrate social justice into climate goals. We talked about green growth and Salvador Allende and onshoring, about mine workers and indigenous resistance, about petronationalism and the decisive power of the state. Thea, hello. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello. Good to see you again through this now virtual format.
So good to see you. So how did your research bring you into this area of extraction and extractivism? And I'm also wondering if you could give us a sense of what do you mean by those terms?
Yeah, so this is a long story that I won't walk us through every step of, but it does start in 2008. And the reason I want to start us there is that is when I first started spending kind of significant time in Latin America, specifically in Ecuador at that moment. And I was witnessing what was happening with what's called the pink tide, which is a moment where there were a lot of left-wing governments kind of simultaneously elected in Latin America. And I was in Ecuador where Correa had recently been elected, and there was a lot going on with social movements that had supported him. They were autonomous, but they supported the left turn in Ecuador. There was a new constitution being written. There were just a ton of kind of popular mobilization. But even in that still kind of exuberant moment, I detected that resource extraction, the kind of territorial kind of patterns of accumulation, the issue of indigenous rights and indigenous self-determination, which are all connected issues in Latin America and throughout much of the global South, that those would be kind of fissure points within this otherwise very exciting moment of left governance in Latin America. And so I began to think about extraction, both from the perspective of kind of global political economy, like what is the role of extraction in capitalism and how does capitalism do extraction, but also in terms of the left and like what is the left's response to the use of natural resources and what is the alternative left model that certainly alternative to neoliberalism, but maybe also what are interesting alternatives to state-sponsored extraction and, you know, how might the left kind of carve out its position here? So that's kind of broadly what turned me onto it. I guess I'm kind of interested in things that are difficult for the left, and I think extraction is one of those subjects. And what is extraction and what is extractivism? I mean, we could do a whole seminar just on that question, but I'll be brief, which is that, you know, extraction, I think, is a more almost trans-historical term, right? I think all human societies have had some type of social metabolism with nature, meaning we take stuff from nature, energy, water, resources. We might use those for ceremonial purposes, for hunting and gathering. It might be agriculture. Whatever it is, humans and nature interact in a metabolic way. What extractivism kind of points to, and I want to be clear that term really emanates from the ground, meaning it's grassroots activists and left intellectuals in Latin America and elsewhere in the global South that really articulated this idea of extractivismo, which is a more systemic way to look at extraction. That's the kind of ism piece. But also it's a way that ties it to the changing patterns of capital accumulation and how capital takes from nature in a way that is distinct from prior kind of social formations, right? It is more rapacious, it's more expansive. In territorial terms, it's more rapacious in terms of like the volume of stuff that's needed. And the reasons for that have to do with the kind of end use of these resources, which are all funneling in to commodity production, to kind of endless growth. Maybe we're reaching some of the limits of growth, so-called, right? But regardless, like this idea that we're going to grow, we're going to sell things. In order to sell things, we need to manufacture them. In order to manufacture them, we need all the raw materials. And since capitalism is kind of always already a globalizing economic formation, in my view at least, and the view of many scholars of capitalism, this kind of also brings capitalism in terms of like centers of manufacturing in relation to peripheries of the world, right? And those peripheries can be sometimes internal, right? We have hinterlands and resource frontiers even within like the kind of core countries. But it can also be very much imperial and external in terms of the kind of colonial reach and then neocolonial reach of global capitalism, grabbing land, grabbing energy, grabbing resources from places that are not only kind of economically subservient, but also politically dominated by kind of core powers. So really broadly, that's the kind of sweep of what we mean by extractivism. And, I think that again, I want to just bring us back to who articulated this term, because I think that extractivism emerged as a concept in that same moment that I started us out with. It was in that moment of the pink tide in Latin America, of this exciting moment of left governance, but in realizing that resource extraction was going to continue to be a part of the political economy, and should movements be supportive of what governments were doing, which was primarily thinking of ways to expand the state role in resource extraction and to orient it towards social benefit. Or should we be contesting the whole system of, quote, extractivism and looking to pathways to transition to like a post-extractive economy in Latin America and globally?
Can you tell us a bit more about what extraction and extractivism specifically has looked like in the areas in Latin America that you've studied, in terms of that relationship, that metabolizing relationship between what we can call the imperial or the capitalist core and its peripheral zones that it extracts from?
Yeah, it is really interesting to observe, because what happens basically is a corporation shows up, so to speak. This is from the local community or local landscape perspective, and begins the process of wanting to do initial exploration, but also simultaneously of wanting to obtain the, quote, social license to extract. And I put that in scare quotes because it's corporate terminology, right? Their goal is to get the community to hopefully be quiescent and not like rebel against them, not resist them, right? So they're coming in, they start doing things to the landscape, they start exploring, they start kind of surveying, right? And simultaneously, they're trying to ensure that they're not going to get local resistance. That's at the local level. And that process can go on for years, right? Because the surveying can take a while, but also there might be, as is often the case, like contention at the local level about the extractive project. And so there's a kind of slow-moving David and Goliath kind of struggle that can sometimes erupt for sure in more intense forms of resistance. All the while, at the national level, in a country like Ecuador, also in countries like Chile, and other places that I've done research, there's a kind of bargain being struck between the government and the corporation in terms of the contract. How much is the government going to get? How much is the corporation going to get? Will shareholders be happy with that, right? Because this is all a financialized process. And so There's a power struggle that involves factors such as like, what's the price for that commodity that day or that quarter? Like, is copper doing well? Is there more to go around, right? So these negotiations between governments and corporations change depending on global commodity market dynamics, right? And so there's a whole kind of complexity at the national scale, but at the local scale, it's a kind of, we might call it a slow violence if we want to take a kind of critical perspective on it. There's a kind of slow violence of territorial control being established by the corporation so that they can extract the copper, the oil, the silver, the lithium, whatever it is, and they can do so under conditions of investor security or investor stability, meaning they're not constantly facing protests or worker strikes, right? And so from the community perspective, this is experienced as a kind of onslaught. You have a very powerful company that likely has some degree of backing from the national government. That can take pretty visceral forms in terms of, if there is a protest, maybe the company has private security guards, but maybe the national police or army are also there to repress that protest, right? You're also having to navigate the difficulty of learning about very technically complex extractive projects. Like, is it a big open pit? How does it affect the water system? How does it affect the stream or biodiversity? Is it going to be overlaid on culturally significant sites if it's an indigenous community that uses the land in particular ways, right? Can you have the mine and the farm in the same place, right? If there's agricultural livelihoods. So there's a whole set of, I would call them existential questions, because mining is considered to often be a basically irreversible process, meaning the way that mining, digging an enormous open pit in the ground, and or digging tunnels, right? There are different types of kind of mine physical plants, but that changes the landscape in ways that can be remediated but cannot be reversed, right? So if what you are looking at is a water system and a mountain and an agricultural plot and a place where the community used to gather, all of that might be covered by a multi-kilometer wide mine. And that mine will then be in activity for decades, because that's how long it will take, to mine everything that's there, and also to recoup the profits and the investment and things like that, right? So communities, when they are concerned, and communities respond to mining in different ways, they do view this as a kind of existential struggle between an existing way of life and a completely altered future in which the mine is really like, everything around them is either the mine or the logistical, energy, water, transportation support system for the mine.
I want to come back to both what that looks like, feels like for the people and for the surrounding land and environment, and also, of course, the politics of contention. But first of all, I'd like to get a sense of what we're talking about extracting here, because part of the reason that the politics of extractivism are so live right now is because there are particular minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, etc., iron for steel, of course, that seem really critical in a green transition away from a global dependence on petrochemicals. So I'm wondering what you think we should be paying attention to in terms of some minerals that are most in contestation here at this moment in history?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I completely agree that part of what makes this challenging for the left is some of our core goals around climate justice and a rapid renewable energy transition also involve, or achieving those goals, at least in the near term, under prevailing technologies, also involves extracted resources, right? And so that picture that I just drew of a community feeling under assault by a corporation, of a government mediating or facilitating that process, of dramatic change in land use and in biodiversity and water, all of those could occur under an eco-socialist government. Maybe the corporation would have it, maybe it would be state-owned, right? I mean, and we could get into those granularities around, is there a different way to do extraction? But the reason that, the sort of rub is that this stuff is needed to some extent in some quantity for our own goals as leftists, as climate justice advocates, and as eco-socialists. So that's, I think, just one kind of place to begin. I'm going to zoom out 1 degree from your question, which is to say that I think part of what is so challenging at this moment is that we have 2 extractive regimes simultaneously. One is a really old one that we can call fossil capitalism, right? Which is a regime that extracts vast quantities of fossil fuels, of hydrocarbons from the earth in order to fuel and power like the entire economy, right? So of course I'm talking about coal, about fossil gas, and about oil. And that system is not only like not dying, like it's not just that it's plateauing, it's like expanding. Like if we go to the UK, if we go to the US, and I'm just saying those places because that's where we're speaking from, there are more oil and gas licenses being given, right? We're at a just really crazy, frenzied pace right now with fossil fuel extraction. So on the one hand, we have the absolute continuity of fossil capitalism. Alongside that, and in a more nascent form, we have what we could call quote unquote green capitalism. You know, a lot of scare quotes there, but I think it's important to sort of name it as like an emergent form of capitalism. And that form of capitalism, too, needs a lot of extraction. I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel where if we really totally phase out fossil fuels and we also use circular economy approaches, et cetera, we could have a green capitalism or an eco-socialism or a green social democracy or whatever that used less mined resources, but that's not what's happening right now. What's happening right now is a global rush or scramble for the mined resources to produce solar panels, to produce electric vehicles, to produce lithium batteries that function on both grid, but also for mobility, of course, to produce wind turbines, transmission lines, all of the physical stuff that makes an energy transmission possible because it enables for the generation, the distribution, and the storage of renewable energy. All of that stuff starts with energy supply chains, that start with extractive frontiers, that start with mining, right? You need cobalt, you need rare earths, you need lithium, you need copper, you need nickel, you need graphite, right? And I could keep going because the list is actually quite long. And, the questions are like, how much do we need and for what exact end use and who is governing this and who's profiting from this? And those political economy questions, the left can intervene in and propose alternate models. But for now, the materiality of the energy transition is such that new extractive sectors are becoming relevant and are growing because they are furnishing the needs of a society hopefully moving towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuels. But right now, both forms of extraction are happening side by side. We can literally go to places like Argentina where there's a growing lithium sector alongside a gas sector, right? And like these are multiple pressures on landscapes and on planetary ecosystems as well.
Would you say those sectors are in contention with each other or are they collaborating? Like what is it like for capitalists at the crux of this contradiction?
Yeah, that's one of the most important questions in a way. Like, how are capitalists handling this? And what are some of the collaborations and tensions among capitalists? And I think we need to be super clear about this from the left so that we can intervene in strategic ways. I used to maybe harbor a little bit of a hope that like there could be a wedge between green capital and fossil capital. What I mean by that is that like if we can sort of pit capitalists against one another because the green capitalists are mad that like the fossil capitalists get all these subsidies and they want the subsidies for themselves instead. And there could be a conflict between them, right? We often talk about divide and conquer as a strategy of the ruling class to divide the working class. But there are all sorts of ways that like we can redeploy or think about divide and conquer where we want elites to be in conflict with one another so that we can weaken hegemony and figure out where our inroad is to power, right? So that would be an almost positive story, like there's competition or contention between green and fossil capital. That is less the case than I would like it to be, right? And instead, what we see is all sorts of collaboration and overlap, even at the firm level, right? I mean, at the level of an individual corporation, because we have companies like Exxon, and I could go down and Glencore, and I'm naming both of those. Exxon, major oil company, Glencore, major mining and commodity trading company that's still invested in coal, to my knowledge. And both Glencore, so they're deeply imbricated in fossil capitalism, Glencore and Exxon, and both of them are making inroads into lithium and other so-called critical minerals, right? So on the one hand, you have the same fossil fuel companies investing in these new energy technologies and in their extractive frontiers, which is not surprising because one great way to pivot as an oil company is to say, we have extractive expertise. In some cases, the extractive techniques there's some similarities or at least there's ways to kind of use that knowledge. And why don't we just extract lithium instead of oil? Or why don't we, get involved in like lithium chemicals alongside petrochemicals, right? And so, there are ways for them to pivot. And then on the other hand, the way that like the sort of green capital lobbying and kind of horse trading has worked out, by that I mean like the way that green capitalists put pressure on the state to kind of subsidize these new supply chains, often involves, especially in the US, I'm not sure if it's the same in the UK, but often involves all sorts of kind of like coalitions with fossil capital. So fossil capital gets some of its goodies and carrots, and green capital gets its goodies and carrots, and like everyone's happy except for the communities and the planet, being kind of that are like the victims of all of this. But there are like endless ways for individual firms to kind of do both, which I think speaks to our all of the above, very unfortunate, all of the above kind of energy transition where we're kind of doing all types of energy rather than really transitioning. But it also speaks to the malleability of capital in these moments of transition in the energy substrate.
So let's talk about those people who are actually on the receiving end, on the sharp edge of this process, whilst the CEOs both of green and otherwise capitalism are sitting pretty, because I'd like to know a little bit more about that mining process and what it looks like, what that means for people and for the environment. Like, what does it take to get lithium, nickel, copper, graphite, etc., out of the ground?
Yeah. So I think the first place to start here is that there's nothing fundamentally different about extracting resources for the purposes of green energy technologies, solar panels, or lithium batteries. There's nothing different about extracting resources for those purposes versus extracting resources for all the other purposes we extract in global capitalism, for manufacturing, for construction, for other electronics that may not be related to the energy transition. So extraction sort of looks the same on the ground, regardless of what the end use is. And the reason I say that right away is that it's not like extraction for green ends is like green, right? It's still the same extraction. And so what it looks like, I think there's a few main categories of harms or of impacts that need to be addressed when we're thinking about the consequences of extraction. One, and a big one, is water. And there's two different ways that mining affects water systems. One is water consumption, and the other is water contamination. And the same project can do both and often does. And what I mean by that is that mining, especially certain sectors, copper is a really big culprit on this front. Mining requires water. It can require it oftentimes for processing and for separating the valuable mineral from the rest of the surrounding rock, right? But there are all sorts of reasons that you need water. And so mining consumes vast quantities of water. Why is this a problem? Well, not always, but many of the landscapes that mining might take place can actually be arid or semi-arid landscapes in which there's already water vulnerability. So if you have a massive mining operation using thousands of liters of water a second or whatever it is, like that, that puts pressure on the other users of that water, which are humans, which are plants and animals, et cetera, right? So that's water consumption. Water contamination is mining can involve all sorts of toxic chemicals. It also exposes parts of the underground earth that are not normally exposed to oxygen. And all of that can result in sort of contaminants entering the water stream. And those can go very far from the site of extraction. I was just talking about kind of arid landscapes where water is under stress. Let's go to tropical landscapes. Like let's go to Indonesia where there might be, nickel mining in some pretty wet landscapes, or, to parts of the Amazonian region in Latin America where there's a ton of mining in ditto, kind of like a rainforest situation. When you have a very wet atmosphere, that creates a different problem, which is that the toxins of mining travel very far because the whole water system is interconnected, right? So you have a mine contaminating a nearby river. That river might be a tributary to the Amazon River, right? Which is the most, biodiverse, ecosystem on Earth. It's the lungs of the Earth, right? That has actual planetary implications. So you have all these ways that that mining kind of messes with the water system through consumption and contamination. I won't spend as long on the others because they're kind of interconnected to that, right? We have impacts on biodiversity. That can happen through water impacts, right? If you use up water that animals were used to sipping, then they don't have their water source, right? You can impact the aquatic life in the water, right? But you're also building, as I said, like a a kilometer deep hole in the ground that's a couple kilometers wide, whatever ecosystem or forest or whatever was there before is now no longer there, and the animals are no longer there. But it's not just the mine site. Like, we have to think really expansively about the geography of mining and the spatiality of mining. And, animals in adjacent habitats and ecosystems are disturbed by the noise and might fly away or run away or seek refuge elsewhere. They might be killed by all of the mining trucks going on these big highways that are now being built in order to get the mining products away from the mine and also to bring workers and other equipment to the mine, right? It really transforms the landscape in a way that I think is hard to capture unless you've been to an open pit mine. I've been to some, of course, in my research. Sometimes I'm researching places before the mining happens, and so there's no mine yet. But I've also been to places already deeply affected by mining. And so, for example, one of the largest copper mines in the world is Chuquicamata in Chile. And I went there on an official government-sponsored kind of visit because it's a state-owned mine. Codelco, the state-owned mining company, operates it. And I stood at the edge of the mine, with the other visitors in our silly hard hats, like kind of looking at it. And vehicles that are like 20 times the size of like a normal car looked like the size of ants. I mean, like, it is so hard to explain the expansive geography of a mine and the pit itself, and then imagining everything around that makes it possible. So these are enormous human interventions into the environment that I think is probably best understood using like the sci-fi language of terraforming. Like, we're literally remaking the earth in the image of extractive capital in a way that has these big consequences. So yeah, everything is affected and everything is connected. Water, biodiversity, prior land uses. Maybe you did agriculture. Maybe you did ecotourism. Maybe you used that land for ceremonial purposes. That is hard to do with a mine next door or on the land that a mine now occupies. So, the implications are quite grave. And those are sort of mostly ecological implications that I've named, with the last one being kind of a socioeconomic one. I just want to note sort of just one more thing, which is that a big trigger for protest is not just the like direct material impacts, right? And I think we know this from all sorts of things, from labor struggles, from feminist struggles, like from racial justice struggles. Like, we know that people don't always organize just because there's an objective harm. It takes more than that. Like, they need to feel mad about it and feel empowered to organize as well. And so a lot of what triggers protest are those material factors that I mentioned, like concerns about water, concerns about biodiversity, land use, et cetera, but with the addition of an insult from the firm or from the government, where you are not only being impacted, but you're also being excluded and repressed, right? So we see in the literature that a big trigger of protest is when no one asks the community what they think about these existential changes, or when the community tries to show up, no one really talks to them respectfully, or when the community protests, like they see the barrel of a gun, which unfortunately in Latin America is common. Latin America is the most dangerous place in the world to be a water or land defender. People literally get killed for trying to defend their land and water. And so it's under those conditions that we see communities rise up and start to connect the dots between political forms of domination and violence and then the ecological impacts of mining.
So how does a company come by the rights and the practical capacity to smack a massive mine in the middle of what was previously people's ceremonial land, people's ancestral land, farmland, cities, villages, places for ecotourism, the stuff of human life, right? So tell me a bit about the politics and legality around like the land on which this extraction happens and what gives them the right.
Absolutely. And that is the right way to phrase it, because it is a legal right that they obtain from the government. And, as much as, as a Marxist, as someone that thinks a lot about capitalism as an economic formation, I really think that extraction and extractivism are domains where we have to take the state really seriously. We have to understand that the state mediates all of this. And at all, like on all facets, it mediates and enables the company's access to the land by land rights or by leases or by concessions and by contracts. So there's a bunch of kind of legal forms that even if the state is, there's a lot of regulatory capture and the extractive firm is pressuring the state, at the end of the day, it's the state that has to sign these contracts and concessions and grant access to the land and to the resources in the subsoil, right? So the state plays a really key role there. And then alongside that, you also have a variety of other permits. They might be environmental licenses, social licenses. In the states that are signatory to certain international treaties, you also have to show some kind of evidence of, consulting indigenous communities. That can be very much like a parchment paper kind of right and very kind of insubstantial depending on the place. But you may have to go through some motions as a corporation and say that you consulted the local community, right? And so those are all of the legal steps that a company has to go through, which is why you hear companies complain all the time. Oh, there's so many permits. There's so much negotiation. We have to do all this stuff. We should speed it up. We should deregulate it, et cetera, right? And so that's on kind of the legal and state terrain. But there's also the terrain of finance, right? Which I think is sometimes leftists misunderstand and in my view, overly conflate finance capital with extractive capital. They are super related, and I think I've sort of already referenced that. They're super imbricated. A lot of these firms, the Western ones, are shareholder owned, right? So they're connected to finance markets. A lot of mining companies also are connected to sort of commodities markets and those kind of trading floors, right? So there's a whole financial aspect to extraction, but the reason it's important to keep these sectors distinct is because oftentimes there are tensions, or at the very least, there is some kind of relationship where the extractive firm needs to prove to investors that the project is viable in order to get investment. And the reason this is so tricky is because, as I said, mining is like a multi-decade endeavor. And there's nothing that finance capital likes less than like slow returns or uncertain returns or like future returns. We want returns yesterday, and we want them guaranteed, and we want them high. And that's not what an extractive enterprise can really offer to its investors. It can't say we're going to turn around and sell this stuff immediately because it might take a few years to construct the mine. You have to do the permits. You have to deal with the community that might not like you. Maybe workers go on strike. There's a lot of potential choke points in the process of extraction. So I think, when you ask like what enables all of this, it's these legal forms and these modes of kind of state mediation of extraction, and then it's the financial mediation and the access to capital. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong on either count, yet we live in a world of growing extraction. Every year more and more is extracted. So obviously this sort of works out more or less from the perspective of capitalism, but I do want to kind of note that each of those are domains where there can be tension among capitalists or between capitalists and state actors.
So what's the role of Indigenous rights, Indigenous people in all of this? Often we find that these massive extractive projects end up being on land that is occupied, has been occupied for many thousands of years, and is very, very lightly, very, very nominally protected under various kinds of legal preserves that reliably, of course, do a bad job in enshrining Indigenous rights. And these appear to us as sites of contention. So what is the picture that we're looking at there?
Yeah, it is concerning. When we look at the kind of demand for new mining as a result of the energy transition, so again, our lithium, our cobalt, our copper, our nickel, all the things that we spoke about earlier, we see that a majority of the kind of known and viable reserves and deposits are located pretty proximate to either Indigenous peoples or other peoples who are kind of land dependent, right? So that those might be peasants who do or don't identify as Indigenous, but regardless, like land dependent and particularly Indigenous peoples. In the US, this is really stark. There was a study that showed that like 79% of like lithium reserves that we know about are within 30 miles of an Indigenous reservation, right? And so when we look at this landscape of mining, it's concerning because it's clear that these mining projects are going to affect people who are already marginalized, already have been dispossessed, already have been kind of deeply harmed and affected by the workings of racial capitalism and of imperialism and colonialism over centuries, right? And it's a kind of repeat pattern, which is very concerning. I will say, though, now to kind of take a different view and look more to what like grassroots struggle can achieve, that what's actually impressive, despite that really concerning picture that I just laid out, is how much Indigenous communities and other kind of locally affected rural communities have been able to kind of change the rules of the game, or at least assert themselves in mining in what are kind of just the most quintessential David and Goliath struggles. Like you have an isolated rural community that has been racialized and faced harm by its own host government or state in many cases, that is sometimes able to slow down, to stall, or even result in the cancellation of a mining project backed by like global financial capitalism and a multinational mining firm, right? That is a very asymmetric battle. And what's impressive is that those battles can be won from the perspective of the local community. And there are lots of cases of that. Part of what helps, as you noted, is that there are international laws that protect rights to consultation or consent. In so many cases, and as you also noted, like they're not really adequately enforced, but the fact that those laws exist at all gives a kind of mobilizing tool to Indigenous communities. They can contest projects in the legal system, right? They can kind of get out of the kind of closed door negotiation of the corporation and the state, and they can take it to the courts, they can take it to the streets simultaneously, and often that is the move. Like there's a legal battle and there's a kind of street battle, so to speak. And we've seen like so many cases of not only individual mining projects being slowed or their terms needing to be changed or contracts renegotiated as a result of these struggles, but what I would call even like bigger victories, like in places like Ecuador, for example, there's not just the right to consultation in the Constitution, but there's also recognized the rights of nature. And communities have taken companies to the court and gotten a defense of the rights of nature out of that, of saying we can't extract here. But even there have been like countrywide referenda, popular referenda that say we can't extract this in the Amazon, or there's special protocol if we're going to extract in this ecosystem. And that really, I think, asserts kind of democracy and also a sense of like planetary well-being into the conversation about mining. So it's not just like a company doing whatever it wants. Like there are guardrails and there are forms of organizing that I think are very savvy, that use direct action, that occupy the mine site, that throw the bodies on the line, so to speak, but that also make use of these legal innovations at the national and international level to really change the game around mining. Again, more mining is happening every year. I'm not trying to create some rosy picture in which we're like transitioning away from extractive capitalism, but I think we need to kind of acknowledge these victories and think about the fact that every time I go to an industry convention, one of the top things on industry leaders' minds is that it's harder and harder to convince communities that mining is beneficial for them. So they're scared, right? And so we should kind of think about what's the organizing opening here.
I'd love to know more about those, because it's such a luxury, right, in my capacity to be able to ask about a victory, right? And it is important, of course, strategically to remember that victory is possible, because otherwise what the hell are we doing here, right? So tell us a bit more about maybe one of those examples that you have in mind.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few. I'll just go to the present moment, which is, there's been an attempt to mine lithium in Serbia. So this is like outside the EU. This is not a place that I've been to or studied, but I'm tracking it closely just because it's so interesting. It relates to lots of geopolitics and geoeconomics between Serbia and the European Union and the efforts to get Serbia in the European Union. And part of that gambit has been Serbia can provide lithium for the European Union and these new supply chains, right? But that has not gone so well yet because there have been massive protests in Serbia against this Rio Tinto project, right? To the point where the government actually revoked the permit for it. And then just recently, I think just in the past month, they tried to reinstate the permit for it. And now we have massive protests again, right? And so, we can, I think, have a complex conversation around like, how would mining happen under eco-socialism, right? And because do like what would we do differently so that it's not a site of such conflict and it's not a cause of such environmental harm? But insofar as this is happening under the conditions of capitalism and deep inequality and kind of great power struggles and geopolitics, like I think we can say that when communities are organizing at the national scale to prevent a specific mining project from moving forward, that's a kind of provisional victory. At least says like this transition can't just be governed by the forces of capital and like their allies in the state, right? So I think Serbia is an interesting example. In Chile and Argentina, too, places that I have done more research, and in Chile I did a lot of field work there, you've seen communities engage in road blockades, in protests in the capital, and that hasn't, those are places where lithium extraction is already happening. And just for listeners to know, it's harder to stop extraction once it's happening than it is to prevent it from happening at all. And that could be counterintuitive, but that's the kind of way that it goes in mining. I think that you get the more victories like before a project has started, like what I just mentioned in Serbia. Then once the mining project is happening, oftentimes the protests can lead to renegotiation, but they may not entirely kind of cancel the project. But regardless, you've seen really brave protests. In Argentina, I mean, there were months-long struggles in Jujuy, Argentina, over various lithium mining projects and over a governor who was very kind of in the pocket of the mining companies. And there was a lot of violence. I don't want to just say that was like a pretty picture, but it's like incontrovertible that the communities have asserted themselves and have stalled processes that the government and corporations wanted to happen much more quickly, right? And then, in Ecuador, you've had recent victories where a copper project, again, copper is very related to the energy transition, is not going to move forward at all because of it violates the rights of nature and because communities won that, right? So we can go across the global extractive frontier. We can go to Portugal, where this attempt by Savannah Resources has been trying to mine in Portugal. That's been delayed for years. In fact, like the prior prime minister had to resign over some corruption scandals that related to lithium among some other economic sectors. And now they're trying again, but there's been renewed protests. So, I think what we're seeing is that community protest sometimes stops a mine from happening, sometimes makes a company have to pause its operations to renegotiate, sometimes just prolongs the process of a company getting financial capital interest, because the longer and more contentious it takes for a company to get its permits and to get its contract and to obtain the, quote, social license, the less interested finance capital is. So sometimes this is a weird story of like finance capital just says, no, we're not going to invest in this anymore. And that's how the mine dies, right? And so there are a lot of different ways for things to go kind of haywire. And again, I think we as leftists should think, what are the choke points at the local level and at the national level for, people power to kind of assert itself? But maybe this is where I think we need to level up a little bit. What else can left movements, political parties, et cetera, at the other end of the supply chain, like where all this stuff is getting funneled into to be used for electric vehicles, for solar panels, for the stuff that we're demanding that our governments deploy rapidly in order to address the climate crisis? Like, what can we do elsewhere beyond the sites of extraction to kind of be in at least an implicit coalition with these movements at extractive frontiers, right? And like, what does solidarity look like? And also, what does a different mode of production and consumption for the energy transition look like, such that we might not need as much volume of mining as like the forecasts kind of tell us that we'll need?
And when we're beginning to articulate what the left should do, what the left can do, I think it is super important to, as you said earlier, take the state seriously and think about how the left can, how the left has used levers of state power and the contradictions that it's immediately confronted with in some ways because of what those levers are designed to do. We can look to instances, for instance, of petronationalism in Latin America, and for a more home-based example, we can think about Clement Attlee's government in 1945 and the monstrosities it committed in order to keep a stranglehold over the supplies of rubber from Malaya and oil from Iran. Can you talk about how those contradictions have presented themselves to you in your research?
Yeah. Thanks for asking this, because I think, there's kind of two intertwined histories that we can tell of extractive capitalism or extractivism. One is the one we've already told, which is like, centers of power, whether corporations or global north governments, kind of rapaciously sucking resources out of the global south or out of their own internal hinterlands, all for the purposes of capital accumulation, right? And causing a lot of harm in the process. And that is one side of the coin. And it's a very important one. But the other side is a long history of attempts to change that. And that history is almost as long as the first history, right? And so this really heated up in the kind of mid-20th century, but even starts before then, where in Latin America, you had some of the first attempts in the 1920s the first attempts outside of the Soviet Union to nationalize resources, right? So in 1922 in Argentina, that was the first nationalization of resources in Latin America and in the world outside of the Soviet Union, right? They'd just done the Russian Revolution, right? So they were doing lots of that stuff. And then in the 1930s, in Bolivia, in Mexico, you have nationalization of tin, of oil, right? And then in the 40s, 50s, 60s, every decade, and it really heats up in the 70s. Of course, you have the famous example of Allende before he's brutally deposed by Pinochet, partly related to this fact, completes the nationalization of Chilean copper mines and wrests their control from U.S. copper companies who had controlled like 80% of Chilean copper production, right? So you have a really long history of global South governments. We could go to the Middle East, right? We could go to other places in the world. I just work on Latin America. We go to Africa, right? You have some similar stories. But some of the reason this starts earlier in Latin America is Latin America, those countries become independent in the early 19th century, right? So then they're like, we're politically independent, but economically subservient. And so this begins a process of trying to wrest back control of resources from the global north, from extractive firms, right? OPEC is another kind of pinnacle of this process. I think, OPEC, we might have mixed feelings about on the left right now, right? It's become a kind of, a place where a revanchist monarchy in Saudi Arabia is kind of exerting a lot of geopolitical power. I'm not seeing OPEC as currently a force of liberation, but in the early 60s, it was. In the early 60s through the 70s, OPEC was very much a way for global South governments that were oil exporters to change the rule of the game, to fundamentally rewrite the kind of prior history, which had been one of 7 US, UK, and European-based oil companies running the whole oil show. And instead, you had national companies being erected and nationalized forms of extraction. And that then inspired other moves in other resource sectors, right? And so you have this long history of global South governments, whether for anti-colonial reasons, for developmentalist reasons, under popular pressure. Sometimes it was workers demanding this, right? It depends on the case, saying we're going to control our own resources. And I think that's an inspiring story. I think the tricky part comes in like, what are the ecological impacts of nationalized resource extraction? Are indigenous communities better off when it's a state-owned company versus a shareholder-owned company, right? How exactly does owning the resources funnel into sustainable forms of economic development, right? So it kind of answers as many questions as it raises, but I think that it's an important step from my perspective. I mean, I'll just go on the record. Like, I think that public ownership is a good idea. I think that it is better than having foreign corporations and foreign capital control not only resources, but the territories of those resources. So I do think public ownership and nationalization can be really important steps towards kind of a more just global economy. But I think there are other aspects that needed to be added. And I don't say this as just like, this is my opinion, but this is what, the activists I speak to on the ground tell me in Latin America and elsewhere that, yes, we want more public control and we want democratic control, not just like state technocrats, but we want like popular control over resources. But we also want to think of ways to limit extraction and even say, not have it at all in certain areas, right? Like maybe certain ecosystems just can't handle it. So I think there are really interesting ways, and Chile is a great example of this, not in terms of what's happening, but in terms of the visions that activists have proposed and how much they've kind of captured, public attention. That, we should be combining national ownership with ecological guardrails in a new way. And that those ideas at least are on the table in Chile in a way that I would say is historically unique, because the history of resource ownership and nationalization in the global South is generally more anti-colonial and developmentalist and not always, related to ecological concerns. And so how can we combine ecology and public ownership? And I think that's actually something we need to think about on the left about the energy transition as a whole. So I think it actually could inspire interesting ideas in other parts of the energy transition beyond extraction.
You mentioned Allende. I'm curious to know more about the pressures that governments and activists and movements within the global South might be facing from their own governments, from foreign capital, from foreign governments, in terms of when they actually try and propose these measures that you were talking about.
Yeah, it's a interesting and tricky time to be like an anti-extractive activist because there's a long history of being told that, like, if you organize against a mining project, like, you're undercutting economic development, that you are, of course, like, eating into the profits of the multinational company. Like, those are longstanding kind of responses that anti-extractive activists might face when they're organizing. But now there's a new thing added, which is this mining is necessary for climate action, right? Like, that's a new thing that communities are being told, that, like, if you resist this mining project, you're actually slowing down climate action, which is not true in its particulars in a variety of ways. But what I want to just kind of share with listeners is that mining companies that have operations in the sectors related to the energy transition, so the copper, the lithium, nickel, et cetera, are presenting themselves as, like, climate actors, right? And so that's a whole new thing that communities and movements kind of have to deal with. But there's a variety of risks. Some of them I already mentioned, which is, like, you may face repression, you may be criminalized for your dissent. That's what the local community might feel. You might go to jail, you might get a death threat. That depends where you are in the world. But certainly your life may be made unpleasant if you resist these projects. But I think that you're also asking about kind of national political economy, like what is the leverage that mining companies have over, the host government, so to speak. And you referenced Allende, and that when Allende nationalized the copper mines, like, President Nixon said, we're going to make the economy scream. And and really nationalizing and expropriating the assets of U.S. firms was a pivotal moment that the U.S. became much more supportive of a coup. And then afterwards was very allied with the Pinochet regime in all of the violence that it did, and also in all of its courting of foreign investors and the way those two pieces came together, right? So that's an extreme example of, like, you expropriate and then a coup happens. That's not always what happens these days. That happened a lot during the Cold War for a variety of reasons. Now they're not zero coups, but they're not happening at the same. U.S. sponsored coups. They occur, but there was a time period in which that was a real risk. Like, you nationalize something, whether it's Iran in the 50s, whether it's Chile in the 70s, and you can just expect the CIA at your doorstep. Now things have gotten a little more savvy, a little more indirect, and I think, like, a lot of the risk that host governments face is a combination of capital flight and investor arbitration, right? So if you start nationalizing things, you risk companies just saying, okay, we will not do business with you. That's capital flight. And, if we're an anti-capitalist, we might say, cool, capitalism's leaving. But that's not cool, because what's happening is the kind of investor base is leaving, and then these countries that rely on those tax revenues and those royalties, like, can't pay their bills, don't have money to invest in social services, and it creates a variety of knock-on effects that can be really economically devastating. So capital flight is one of the biggest forms of leverage that extractive corporations or any company has. The other is investor arbitration, and we see this quite a bit. All of these countries are party to free trade agreements, or even just written into the contracts with the firm, that if you do anything that impinges on profits, and of course, the biggest way to do it is to say we're expropriating, this asset, then we take you to court. And that is a huge, imagine you're already a global South country with unsustainably high levels of sovereign debt. You already owe private credit markets, the IMF, et cetera. Now you're being taken to court in a opaque system of investor settlement dispute, and now you're paying, like, millions of dollars in fines to this company that you never even made a dime on because they didn't even start, and so it governments in the global South, between debt, extraction, the system, the architecture of global finance and trade, are really, like, up against a wall. It's honestly impressive that there are moments where those governments feel emboldened at all to at least, like, renegotiate contracts or to try to get more. We don't see as much these days of the classic forms of, like, nationalization and expropriation that we saw in the 1920s through the 1970s. Like, literally, this is my asset now and no compensation for you. We do not see as much of that because of the risks of capital flight and arbitration that I just mentioned, which have grown under the neoliberal period. We see more governments asserting themselves when they have a bit of leverage because the commodity prices are higher, or they have a really unique and strategic mining sector in their country that's very strategic for global capitalism. That can give them a bit of leverage, and they can say, you can extract this, but we're going to get higher royalties, higher taxes, or at the kind of highest end, our state-owned company is going to do this in a joint venture with your multinational firm. And so those are kind of the edges of where we see government being assertive in the global South, but there's a lot of constraints and double binds in our sort of global political economy.
Could you give us a sense of what the work of mining is like for the workers?
The first thing to understand about mining is that it has become an increasingly capital-intensive and tech-intensive industry. So we were talking about, we've been talking about financialization, but there's also the technologification, I don't know how to say that, of the mining industry, meaning like mining and finance have their relationships and mining and tech have their relationships. And the reason is that, mining has, like many industries, replaced workers to varying degrees with robots of various sorts, right? So you have these large vehicles at the mine site. Those vehicles are bringing equipment in and they are bringing ore out, right? And those vehicles might have one worker, but it's a huge vehicle, right? Doing a lot of the moving itself, right? And you might have a worker driving it. That worker might be not in the vehicle. It might be operating it remotely. So we have driverless technology and remote technology. We have the use of drones for surveying, right? We have all of these ways that technology, it never fully replaces workers. That's a capitalist fantasy and a capitalist contradiction because you need workers to exploit always. But it is reducing the amount of workers necessary for a given output of mining by replacing them with technology, with sensors, with computers, with all of these things, right? And so the reason I belabor this a bit is because, one, I think we have a sometimes archaic notion of mining as a lot of drudgerish work, which it can be, and some mine sites in the world are still really operate that way, but it's also a very technological enterprise at this point, which has a second implication, which is that mining companies often promise lots of jobs to the community. That's actually their main way of saying, community, you will love this mine because there will be hundreds of new jobs. And when you look at the fine print, the majority of those jobs are in the construction phase, which for obvious reasons is more labor intensive than capital intensive. But once the mine is up and running, those workers are let go and fewer workers are required. More of the labor force might be so-called white collar or engineers or technicians, operating this machinery and doing other types of more technical work. And so it's not to say that we've eliminated the oftentimes brutal work of mining. And it is brutal and it is dangerous. And mining is actually, despite all these technologies, getting more dangerous over time. I'll come back to that in a second. But you still have the workers and you still have, drudgerous work, but you also have more technical work and more machinery, right? And that capital intensity is part of what relates to the need for massive finance to support all of this, right? Because it can be an expensive operation. So that's kind of what mining work is like. Historically, we've had the phenomena of mine workers being kind of the vanguard of the working class in certain moments, right? Certainly, obviously there was the mine workers versus Thatcher, but prior to that, amazing mine workers organizing in the UK. There's a long history in the US Appalachia region of mine workers organizing. South Africa, we could go around the world. There's been really militant mine worker organizing, and there are interesting reasons as to why mine workers tend to be militant. And we still have a bit of that, right? There are still cases today, for sure, where mine workers stage really dramatic strikes and get better contracts, and that absolutely is still part of the story. It's not what I work on as much, but it is definitely there. What's interesting is that mine workers are now kind of alongside mine workers. We have mobilized communities in new ways, right? So the picture of mining related conflict is no longer primarily just a labor picture. It's also a picture of community and social conflict. I think sometimes the really powerful cases combine both of those, right? So you have instances of protests. Again, this happened in Chile, actually, at a lithium mine, and it's happened many times at copper mines in Chile, where you've had workers on strike or threatening a strike, and you've also had the community mobilized, blockading the mine, and that, as you could see, creates a lot of pressure on capital to go to the negotiating table. And so that's interesting where those coalitions emerge. I think we should kind of pay attention to them. I want to just add one other thing, which I said I'd get back to, which is the danger of mining, because mining work, despite fewer workers being needed, remains dangerous to the workers and to the community around it. And one reason for that is the issue of mining waste and waste storage. So whenever you're mining, there's like a subset of the rock that is the valuable mineral, and the rest, excuse me, is considered waste from the perspective of capital. Like that, I don't need the rest of that rock, right? I'm good, and that just creates a huge waste pile. These are called tailings piles or tailings basins. That's the leftover rock that's not being used. And those pose an enormous safety hazard. There are these enormous piles or basins of rock that is also a bit sludgy, that also might be contaminated with mining-related chemicals. And so it's like a toxic physical mess of a waste pile. And over time, the concerning trend is that we're seeing more and more failures of those waste piles. What that means is like the pile collapses, it breaches its basin, it breaches its dam, and it creates an avalanche. We've literally had community members like killed and like huge toxic messes infiltrating streams as a result of this. So, and that trend is getting worse, not better over time. And the reason for that is sort of interesting, and I'll sort of just close out with this point, is that over time, and this is especially true in sectors like copper, where we've been mining copper for hundreds of years, and there are fewer and fewer good copper deposits out there. So the places being mined have a really small percentage of copper compared to the rest of the surrounding rock. And what that means is like the ratio of waste is much more. And so wherever you're in a sector where you're kind of just eking out like the kind of deposits that are not the best ones because they've been, the sector has been mined for so long, means that you create enormous waste piles. And it's super underregulated in basically everywhere. And so that is creating more of these failures and safety hazards relating to the piles of waste. And the workers are the front line. They're the first affected by that and killed in those cases or injured. And then the community and the natural environment is kind of second in line for getting the kind of impacts when those failures occur.
So what's the role of onshoring here? You've written about the development of new lithium mines in the global north. How does that affect the picture that we've been discussing here, particularly how it redounds to global supply chains and where these sort of green capitalists, if you like, are looking, and where eco-socialists might be looking too, in order to think about, yes, how we can obtain some lithium to get the technology that we need and will need more urgently in the future, but without the sorts of patterns of violence and extraction that you might be talking about here.
Yeah. Onshoring, I think, is a fascinating development. It does bring us back to a theme in our conversation, which is the role of the state and how states kind of in extractive sectors kind of set the parameters, including the territorial and geographic parameters of extraction in a variety of ways. And onshoring is also interesting to me because it was an unexpected development that I had to kind of make sense of in the moment. My research had been planned to be primarily about Latin America, which is a place I've written a book on and written lots of things on and spent a lot of my time and have family connections. And so it is where I've really thought about extraction has been in Latin America. But an interesting turn of events happened, and it started actually even before the pandemic, but it accelerated during the pandemic. It accelerated even more with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and with a variety of commodity shocks and other turbulences in the sort of global scene. And so what global North governments, and I count among them, of course, the UK, the US, Canada, the European Union and its member states, what those governments are doing in the midst of this kind of polycrisis, these geoeconomic turbulences, are saying, we can't rely on these, quote, vulnerable supply chains, which is, by the way, like something that left critics of globalization had said a long time ago, right? But regardless, we can't rely on these global supply chains. Instead, what we want to do is onshore, or in some cases reshore, because, for example, the U.S. had a large lithium sector in the mid-century for not battery purposes, for other purposes, and it sort of just let that sector wither, and then China and the rise of other power, right? And so there's often a story of like sometimes these mining sectors existed, and then they were considered not that economically important and allowed to kind of wither away, and while finance and service sectors and high-tech sectors kind of predominated and grew. But regardless, whether it's onshoring or reshoring, you have a situation in which global North governments see that supply chains have vulnerabilities, see also that there's a bunch of new supply chains that need to be kind of built and constructed in order to serve these green technologies that we've been talking about. But also, and this is the most important factor in all of this, are in increasing competition, rivalry, and outright tension in the case of the US with China, right? And the kind of perspective of US policymakers for actually kind of over a decade now, but the pandemic and the subsequent geopolitical kind of tensions gave a bit more of a window of opportunity. But since really the financial crisis, U.S. policymakers have started to say, wait a second, like here we are in crisis. Again, this is during the financial crisis. China is ascendant. It's like gobbling up global resources. This was the commodity boom that was really driven by China for its own industrialization, right? And so they were like, we have to think about that these resources are more secure if they're within our borders, right? China has a whole strategy of internal extraction within its own hinterlands and external kind of resource acquisition, and that the kind of global north promoted like neoliberal globalization and free trade and dispersed supply chains was becoming a potential vulnerability in the kind of fight for supremacy over these new supply chains, which were in an extremely nascent stage in like the early 2000s, but were on the horizon and now are obviously like key to the global economic future, being able to manufacture things like solar panels and semiconductors. I'll add those in, even though it's not per se about the energy transition, but is viewed as a critical sector, right? And so what the kind of change in thinking has been is like, oh, instead of like importing these minerals and metals and raw materials from abroad, which the global north used to be fine with, because basically it meant you offshored sectors that were environmentally toxic, socially contentious, and also low value add compared to the downstream parts of the supply chain. And so it made total sense to kind of not have this stuff, quote, in our backyard. But now, under new geopolitical, geoeconomic, and kind of mode of accumulation circumstances, it's beginning to make sense for global North policymakers to kind of, we might even say, copy China's playbook, like exploit your own hinterlands more and be more strategic about where else in the world you're exploiting. And so what onshoring looks like is a drive or an effort to have the complete supply chain for any of those end-use technologies, from mine to processing to refining to factory to final consumption, to have all of that within your borders or as a second best within the borders of your allies or friends, hence the ally shoring or friend shoring silly jargon that also exists now. So, the idea is like, we don't trust global markets, even though we're the ones that like impose that on the whole world. Oops, like they're not great in moments of geopolitical turbulence or climate crisis or commodity shocks. And it would be more secure to have this stuff closer to home. And not only that, but to incentivize companies that are building battery plants or EV plants to use the domestic sources so that we can, quote, dominate and achieve supremacy. Whether that's doable, whether the idea of the U.S. being like more self-sufficient in these raw materials, or Europe being, Europe is a place where there hasn't been significant mining outside of coal for kind of a century. Like really, Europe has been completely dependent on mining imports. So whether the idea that Europe is now going to self-supply a significant portion of its own minerals, which is now written into law as the European Critical Raw Materials Act, I think it's called, that like a percentage, I forget if it's, 20% is going to come from European sources, another 20 from like recycled in Europe, and another from our friendly nation. There's a whole like formula now. And this is not unrelated to the efforts to mine in the UK as well, and efforts to mine, in Portugal, the Serbia story I told earlier. In the US, we're having an incredible, just like astounding rush to mine resources. The US is a large country, unlike some of the European countries I just noted. It's a large country with a lot of mineral resources in it, and actually has had more of a mining history than some of the countries in Europe. So there's a lot to potentially dig up in the U.S., and there's a big push to do so. In the U.S. West, like the western states, California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Arizona, et cetera, there is such a rush that there's like 100 different proposed lithium projects, 100. I'm not just saying that. That's like the actual number. Proposed lithium projects across just that part of the U.S. Now, we've already discussed mining is financialized. It's speculative. Some of those projects won't get investors, of course. But just to have that many interested corporations and individual investors literally staking claims in the ground, it's like a Wild West scenario. That's still how mining happens in a lot of the U.S., right? Literally staking these claims in the ground is a sea change from, a decade ago when it was just assumed that we would import raw materials and, do our finance and service sectors and tech sectors and not be extractive, aside from oil and gas, which has been a thing that the U.S. does for a long time. But in terms of mining, a decade ago, if you had asked me, I would not have thought that mining would be a part of the U.S. economy that the government is subsidizing and trying to grow, and that corporations are getting involved in.
How should we be talking and thinking about the role of technology in this moment of energy transition, or hopefully energy transition, right? I guess because various areas across the political spectrum conceive of technology, particularly digital technologies, as this kind of airless, immaterial phenomenon with no inputs that's just plucked out of human genius to solve all our problems that we didn't even know that we had. But of course, as we know, it requires a material basis. And as soon as you start getting into the detail of that material basis, you start brokering about what actual people's lives actually looked like. We can point to things like the discourse around electric vehicles as an example. So yeah, what's the role of technology in all of this and how we think about that?
Yeah, I think that the kind of idealization of the tech industry and tech sectors as this kind of like postmodern, post-material, like kind of we're in the future. We no longer rely on nature. We're doing everything in a lab or in a like tech startup in Silicon Valley. We've kind of decoupled ourselves from nature, right? And this aligns with a certain actually vision of kind of like eco-modernism, which is a term out there for thinking like we can actually fundamentally decouple from nature so that we can grow and have technological modernity and futurity without the pesky thing of like nature and environmental harm and annoying communities that are resisting things, right? Well, it turns out it's quite the opposite, because all of these technologies have their start in mining. All of them involve land footprints and have energy and water footprints as well. Even things like, of course, like the data centers and servers that power the technologies and enable like our internet connection right now and everything are extremely energy intensive, right? So everything comes back to nature. Nature is inescapable because humans metabolize nature. That is just like part of the human condition, right? And so the idea that we can escape that is a fantasy, but it's a dangerous fantasy because I think that it can permit, in a kind of paradoxical way, the idea that we can escape from the kind of mucky nature that is the beginning of all production, kind of, I think, gives license to a fantasy that we can also whatever we do, as long as the end product is clean and green, like is fine, right? So in a weird way, this idea that like we're no longer relying on nature because what we're doing is like creating the future of like the Jetsons or whatever, can actually serve as a justification for some pretty gnarly practices in terms of extraction, right? And that itself is like a contradiction that we should attend to. But as much as they, the vaunted kind of new technologies like kind of proclaim this decoupling from nature, I think that, again, if you go to the industry conferences, if you read the business press, if you kind of like see what's actually being discussed, not for public consumption, but amongst themselves, they're very concerned about all this stuff. They're concerned about like volatility of commodity markets and like when prices are really high for a certain commodity, copper, whatever it is, right? They're concerned about those price volatilities. They're concerned about community protests. They're concerned that governments in the global south are getting more assertive in certain ways. Like we were talking about resource nationalism, but there's also other things. Countries from Indonesia to Zimbabwe to Chile are trying to assert their leverage and move up the supply chain, meaning don't just take the resources out of our country. Like, we want to actually process these resources here and maybe even make batteries here. And Indonesia has banned raw material exports of nickel. Zimbabwe is doing the same for lithium, right? So there are these assertions from the global south that remind people of the Opec days, right? And so there's like, as much as there's this fantasy, I think that they're very aware of the reality. They're worried about it. And what they're trying to do is get governments on board to support them during this intense extraction phase for the energy transition. In fact, I was just reading a Financial Times article about the UK, about firms that want to extract critical minerals in the UK, saying like, we need more help from the finance sector, and we need more government help in order to make this happen. The same thing's happening in the U.S. Companies they've already gotten a lot of subsidy and tax credits from recent U.S. legislation, but they're asking for more because they're concerned about their ability to kind of weather the volatilities and uncertainties of these extractive frontiers. And so yeah, I think that they know that what they're saying about like perfectly clean technologies is fundamentally false, but their ability to say that is politically powerful.
Tell us more about those exciting, those unique solutions that you've come across in Chile, those resolutions potentially on the table about what modes of resource management might look like in an eco-socialist future, possibly in an eco-socialist present, fingers crossed, to navigate that dilemma that we've been talking about between, on the one hand, the urgency time-wise of the need to turn away from fossil capitalism, but on the other hand, the need to not replicate its injustices in a different form of extraction.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. I want to, I think, make one contextual point. So we were just talking about onshoring, and it would be easy to think, based on what we were just saying, that all of a sudden all the mining is going to happen in the global north, which has its own problems that we need to deal with, of course, right? And like, who's affected by that? Oh, whoops, it's indigenous communities in the U.S., right? Like it's marginalized communities, and there's a similar frontier dynamic, or it's rural hinterlands in Portugal, right? So sometimes the communities across global north and south have things in common, even though, of course, like the North is the wealthier part of the world and is on the whole like extracting more resources from the global South. But what I want to be clear is that alongside new resource frontiers in the global North, under this kind of banner of onshoring and supply chain security, you have continued and intensified extraction in the global South. Why? Because there's growing demand for all of these things. So you can have a mine in the global North, you can have a mine in the global South. Like there's a market for all of it, right? And so it's not at all the case that onshoring is like relieving the global South of its role in providing resources to global capitalism. Not at all. So you have continued forms of unequal exchange, unequal ecological exchange, economic exchange and ecological exchange, both fundamentally unequal between South and North. And you have a lot of interesting movements and policy ideas bubbling up in Latin America, where there's been, a century at this point of attention to definitely the economic inequalities of being a resource provider for the global economy, and maybe a few decades of attention to the deep ecological impacts of that. And what's finally beginning to happen, which for me as an observer and someone who's tried to be also in solidarity with some of these movements, is quite fascinating, is that we're moving to a place where there are ideas that combine resource nationalism, so the public should own the resources, the state should own the resources, with like ecological regulation. And I think this is in some ways the most advanced in Chile. Chile is the second largest producer of lithium. It's a place where lithium has been mined for quite a while now, and where the impacts of that mining in these beautiful salt flats and wetlands of Chile's desert system. So they're kind of desert wetlands that are just extremely important, also very vulnerable ecologically. And there are salt flats, and the lithium is underground in this brine. It's actually a quite unusual mining method that's interesting, but also has a lot of ecological and social harms attached to it. So Chile has like a lot of experience, and the local communities and landscapes and also animals and plants in the area have a lot of experience with how mining can go wrong, right? It's right now, the lithium mining in Chile is all done by two multinational firms. One is based in the US, one is based in Chile, right? And so but they're multinational. They have mining everywhere in the world, right? These two companies, Albemarle and SQM. So there's a lot of experience with the bad sides of mining. And also Chile is the number one copper producer, right? And so copper in the world, right? So Chile has an enormous copper industry, and that relates to our prior conversation about, Allende nationalizing copper and all of that, right? So there's a lot of experience with the harms of mining and with the inequities of mining, and that experience has accumulated over the years into proposals for how to do it differently. And the kind of latest of those proposals is we should mine less, and it should be under public ownership. And we should not mine in places where the water system is simply exhausted. And so what the kind of progressive government in Chile has proposed, and it's Gabriel Boric. People may know about him. He was a government that was elected like out of the kind of 2019 huge uprising in Chile, right? So, and he himself was like a student leader and is really young. He's younger than me, which is kind of crazy to say. He's like the millennial president. And so, he has a progressive orientation, and he promised from day one, not even before day one, on the campaign trail, that he would, one, bring lithium under more state control and establish a state-owned company to mine lithium, and that there would be, quote, no more sacrifice zones, which is the language used, around the world to refer to places that have been deeply harmed by extraction and mining, right? And he said this was his promise. And once in government, he, to a degree, made good on trying to implement those promises. A state-owned company is in the process of being established. For now, the state-owned copper company is kind of the one ushering this forward before the lithium one is officially kind of up and working. And he also has promised to protect 30% of the salt flats, because there are lots of these salt flats in Chile, and they all have the lithium resources underneath them, that he's going to protect 30% of salt flats, set them aside. And so that sounds good. And I want to just flag, that is a result of like a lot of social mobilization over 2 decades to protect the salt flats, to get these companies under more public control. So that he's even saying that is due to social movements. But then, the devil's in the details, right? And so I would be remiss, and my Chilean comrades will be mad at me if I present this in a rosy way, right? So I want to say that despite those promises, there's a lot of questions being raised because, the other salt flats that aren't the 30% protected, some of them have a really lax kind of environmental regime, and they're really trying to court new companies, and they're not regulating it very much, right? What are the actual terms of these joint ventures between the state and foreign companies? Communities have at multiple points during his government protested, put their bodies on the line, actually blockaded mining from happening, and made a major company pause, the major lithium company pause its operations for a week because they were fundamentally unsatisfied with some of the ways that the government was negotiating with these firms. So tension doesn't go away. Contestation doesn't go away. Like, that's what I want to say about thinking about extraction from the left. It is just a thorny issue because extracting resources has environmental impact. The people most affected by that are the people that live right there. There's an inequality and a spatial inequality to the impacts, like from the get. And so how you manage that is quite complex. I think the Boric government has made some errors. I'm not going to be the one to judge that, but I more want to say that even under the case of a progressive government with a new form of commitment to both resource nationalism and ecological sanity, has had difficulty convincing locally affected communities and other constituencies that it's really going to do this in a new way, right? And I just think it speaks volumes about both the inspiring proposals out there, but also like the difficulty in implementing them in a way that is fundamentally just.
From one contentious topic to another, how do you think about the frameworks of green growth, degrowth, anti-growth in these discussions?
I think that they can get too broad. And what I'm really interested in is sector by sector. How are we going to reduce the material throughput, reduce the material footprint and volumes of earthly materials that are needed, while also ensuring that we make really rapid headway on climate action and decarbonization, and also ensuring that that is as just and democratic as possible. So I'm happy to kind of, in some moments align myself with a degrowth perspective, mainly because I do think it is vital. And I speak to the kind of more rigorous versions of what degrowth means. Like, it's not just about, reducing GDP. When you look at, I think, the good literature on degrowth, it's really about reducing, as I put it, the material throughput, how much resources, water, energy we're using as a global economy or in a national context or whatever, how we can reduce that in order to not kind of overuse resources and create all of these environmental impacts. So I am on board with that. But the question is, how do we do it technically? And how do we do it politically, right? And I think that those are actually harder questions than it's easy to position yourself in like an internecine left debate. Like, I'm the green growth person, I'm the degrowth. Like, okay, great. But like, how do we actually do this in a practical way? And I think there are degrowth people and people on all sides of this debate that are tending to this. So I'm not trying to be snarky. I just think that the discourses get a little, speaking of decoupling, the discourses get a little decoupled from the materiality, that we need to get our hands a little dirty. And by that, I do not mean make weird tactical coalitions with people we hate. I don't mean that kind of dirty. What I mean by dirty is like situate ourselves in the earthly matter and how we're actually going to build supply chains differently, or build a mine differently, or decide we don't build a mine there at all, because that would be too deleterious to the local environment. The local community is too resistant to it, right? Like, practically speaking, how do we do this? And the way that I think about this is to look at the entire supply chain and find every single point in that supply chain where, if a change is made, sometimes it's a technical change, like it's a different battery design, or sometimes it's a policy change, like it's a different way to deploy these technologies and to integrate them into our built environments. There are all sorts of changes. And if you look broadly at the supply chain, there are a lot of leverage points to reduce how much material is demanded by the end-use commodities that are being produced, right? And I think that's the way that we should look at it. And then we can actually see that not only are some of our goals less like zero-sum, like opposed to one another that we might think they are, but actually there are interesting kind of cross-fertilization and affinities between our different goals, right? And I'll just lay out, the goals being like rapid climate action, rapid decarbonization, reducing material use, and making it as just and equitable as possible. Those can feel in tension, right? Because you want rapid decarbonization? Well, that means you have to like rapidly dispossess people of their land in order to get the cobalt out of the ground. It's like, well, actually, no, because doing decarbonization quickly doesn't mean it has to be more materially intensive. And in fact, doing it less materially intensive can actually sometimes be faster, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but I'll be concrete with an example. The slowest way to decarbonize transportation is also the most resource-intensive way to do it. So it's the worst for climate, and it's the worst for local landscapes, which is what we're currently doing, which is everyone should own a personal electric vehicle.
Right.
Like, that's the plan. That's the path we're on. It is the slowest path to our climate targets, because just imagine the coordination dilemma of like one-to-one replacement, getting every household to like stop using this car that they bought, 2 years ago, that they spent money on, that they're still paying off. Like, no, don't use that anymore. Use this EV. We'll give you a little discount. We'll give you a little rebate, and just like strand your household asset. Like, that's a hard thing to convince lots of households and consumers to do. So, that's not like that's often presented as, it's the easiest way to move forward because everyone loves cars. And so instead of a normal, traditional car, we're giving them an EV. But there's lots of obvious obstacles to that. And so, we want every household to have an individual EV. Each of those EVs comes from a relatively resource-intense supply chain. And it's like a slow way to address the climate crisis. So instead, and now there's research, thanks to a team that I worked with, and there's also other researchers around the world kind of looking in a similar vein, we now have the empirical data to show that actually it would be less resource intensive if we could reduce car use, which can happen. Like London did that. Paris did that, right? Like places have reduced car use with congestion pricing, with better mass transit. I'm not trying to say these are perfect places, but they did make a shift in which people are doing a different mode of transportation instead of driving. So you can actually make those policy interventions. And if you do, you achieve 2 amazing or 3 amazing goals at once. If you reduce car use and increase mass transit and walkability and all of these great things. One is you use dramatically less lithium and every other resource because it's much more lithium per person, and in every other way of measuring it, to have everyone be in an e-bus versus individual electric vehicles, right? So you use less lithium. 2 is you get the climate goals faster. Every climate model says the more we can get people out of cars, like the faster we reach our climate goals, even if they're in traditional buses with like a gas engine. Like, it's still better for meeting climate goals faster, let alone like an e-bus, right? And 3rd is you relieve some of the rapacious pressure on landscapes around the world that are facing this critical minerals scramble and rush, because you reduce the total volumes needed, which in my view then opens up a bit more room and breathing space for global South governments to get their house in order in terms of like regulation. It's very hard to regulate a boom. It's almost impossible. There's like very few historical examples where you have a resource rush and you create a great regulatory architecture to govern it. Usually when there's a resource rush, there's a lot of powerful companies showing up at your doorstep. They're lobbying you. They're competing for the contract. You know, it's all a crazy frenzy. And it's hard to kind of have holistic governance, right? So I think that, you know, and then the last thing I was saying is that this would also be more just and equitable everywhere in the world, but also including in the global north communities, meaning that if we move away from car dependency and privatized forms of transportation, then everyone has more transit access. Everyone has that right to mobility, that right to the city. So if we think creatively about transportation policy, about housing and land use policy, all the way at the other end of the supply chain, we can make some real policy interventions that improve well-being in all sorts of ways, but also mean less resource use, less pressure. And we can call that degrowth, and I'll sleep happily at night. You know, we can call that the Green New Deal. We can call that a just transition. You know, I love to play around with language, and I think different frames make sense in different political and scholarly contexts. But what I'm concerned about is on the ground, how are we making this work in a way that addresses the climate change at speed and scale, while also like lifting up the really global and multiracial working class and their needs for, you know, a secure future.
So with the scale of these tasks ahead of us, what gives you hope?
You know, it's such a like challenging moment I mean, I'm in the middle of I'm in the US right now, and I don't know when this recording will be listened to by the audience, but you know, we're in the midst of this like really crazy political moment where Biden has stepped down. We have a new Democratic nominee. There's just like a lot happening on the political landscape that makes it hopefully a little less likely that the forces of fascism will be victorious, right? So I guess in a way I could count myself a bit more optimistic on that front.
God, the fact that that's framed as optimism it's just a condemnation. It's accurate. It's a condemnation of the moment that we're in. I just need to take 45 working days to process it. Sorry, carry on.
No, it's so true. And I think that like the political system has resulted in like rather low expectations, and therefore, you know, things like just not having a fascist in office definitely count as a minor victory. But we'll see. TBD. He could still win. And then we'll be in a different ballgame for sure. But, you know, what gives me hope? I feel like I'm going to sound old in saying this. I'm a so-called frontline millennial, right? So I'm 40. So I'm going to say like the youth give me hope. And I really mean that. And I don't just mean it in like a sort of like Pollyanna-ish way of like the youth are our future, but in a very literal sense, like certainly in the US, I think this case is the same in the UK. It's not the same in every country in the world, but definitely in the US, young people understand all this stuff really well and actually have the right politics on average, right? And so just let's go to the things that I was just saying. It's really hard to get Americans out of cars. I get that, and I'm here for the difficult political organizing that it would take to like shift the policies so that Americans are more interested in transit and shift some of the cultural habits and imaginaries around cars as freedom. Like, but it's a steep hill to climb. I'm not like downplaying that. What's interesting is it's a less steep hill to climb with like Gen Z. They do not like cars. They, in all the surveys and also in their actual empirical behavior, they're less likely to want to own a car. To own a car, they're more likely to want to live in an urban environment in which they can walk places or take transit. They're much more aware of the climate crisis. They're much more attuned to the environmental harms or potential environmental harms of the energy transition and, of course, of fossil capitalism. So when I make this case to a classroom of 20-something-year-olds, to, you know, a political meeting where I'm meeting with like a movement, when I'm talking even to younger like rank and file union members of some of the unions and labor movements that are involved in these supply chains, when I'm interacting with that generation in those contexts, like they are here for it. They're like, great, mass transit means we meet our climate goals more quickly, and we also extract less lithium, and we could also think about ways to redistribute power globally so the global south can do its own energy transition on its own terms. Like 100% here for that. And like those generational changes are sticky. It turns out that opinions we form in our 20s and 30s like stay with us for a long time period. And so I'm somewhat hopeful, including, of course, on Palestine, on a variety of really existential issues for like our global scene, there is some hope to be had in the generation kind of coming up now, getting politically activated now. And I think that politicians are actually like doing a bad job. And again, I'm just speaking to the US. If they're not seeing that as a constituency for new policies on all of those issues that I just mentioned, but germane to our topic, on issues of transit, of resource use, of climate change, right? Like there is actually a constituency out there that is ready to have left-wing policies if only politicians would speak to them. And of course, if more organizing could happen to make those demands heard and give them more leverage.
Thea, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. This was a great conversation.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support or face the consequences.